So yes, I'm Dr. Meranda Roberts or Dr. Owens, depending on how I'm feeling that day. And I'm Northern Paiute. I'm an enrolled member of the Yerington Paiute tribe, which is in Nevada. It is closer to Reno. And I'm also Mexican-American, and I grew up in California, Southern California near Riverside. And as Heidi graciously pointed out, I am at the Field Museum right now as a curator slash postdoc researcher on how to make the museum fix its 70-year-old hall. And how do you begin to understand the ways in which Indigenous people want to be reinterpreted or represented in a space like that? And a few weeks ago, I did a presentation with colleagues on the importance of land acknowledgments, basically what they are supposed to do and that type of thing. However, when Heidi and the group approached me, I realized that this conversation is especially important as we enter the holiday tomorrow, and thinking about what is quote unquote a Thanksgiving. What does that mean to someone like me who places their indigeneity and their sense of spirituality and understanding of indigeneity above all else? That is how I frame my world, and I want to be able to share that with you, as well as give you insight into what a land acknowledgement is and its overall importance, but also what it isn't. I get asked that question a lot, and I want to be as frank and open as possible, and to be able to just express my frustrations when dealing with this. So here are my resources. If you ever want to get in touch with me, I'm very accessible, and I hope that you will be in touch soon. So I'm gonna go ahead and get started on my own land acknowledgement. So I always begin every talk I have with a quote from Angela Davis's book, Freedom is a Constant Struggle, Ferguson, Palestine, and the Foundations of a Movement, where she says, "We know that the historical process of colonization was a violent conquest of human beings and the land they stewarded. It is thus essential that we identify the genocidal assaults on the first peoples of this land as the foundational arena for the many forms of state and vigilante violence that followed. Moreover, the violence of European colonization, including the slave trade, situates the common history of Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and the American hemisphere. In other words, there is a longer and larger history of the violence we witness today, and our understandings of and resistance to contemporary modes of racist violence should thus be sufficiently capacious to acknowledge the embeddedness of historical violence, of settler colonialism against Native Americans, and of the violence of slavery inflicted on Africans. And our work today is evident of the unfinished status of planetary struggles for equality, justice, and for freedom." And so, to honor that fight and that continuing struggle, I acknowledge that as a Northern Paiute woman, I live, work, eat, sleep, and pray on the traditional homelands of the Three Fires Confederacy, the Potawatomi, Ojibwa, Odawa, and also the Sac and Fox, Miami, Inoka, Ho-Chunk, Peoria, and Menominee, as well as many others who came to this land for trade or were removed here from other locations. May we always honor these nations, their sovereignty, their ways of life, and the love they have for their ancestors. And America, or what we understand to be America, will always and forever be Indigenous Native American land. And how I understand land acknowledgements and moving into the future is I'm asking all of you today to donate, and the links are provided in the chat, to donate to one of these organizations your money. And honestly, given that it's Thanksgiving and given that this presentation is being hosted by a school from Harvard, it only makes sense for the people who are watching this, including myself. I will be making a donation after the presentation to honor the ongoing struggles and lifeways that a lot of these communities are still facing today. And if you would like to, be held accountable for that, go ahead and Instagram me. Go ahead and tell me that you did this in some way, shape, or form, because honestly, when we move into the future of what a land acknowledgement is, it needs to be action oriented. And this is the beginning step of what that can look like. And again, as we are moving into tomorrow, we should be thinking about how these communities are still impacted by the impact of settler colonialism as brought by the Pilgrims. And as well as what land Harvard sits on. So again, please donate what you can. And if you don't have money, think about how you can support these organizations through your time, through your effort. Do you have resources that you can make available to people? How can you include us in your boards? How can you begin to how do you begin to like make space for us in your organizations, in your classrooms, in your even in your stores, anything like that? How can we be better at making space for Indigenous people and understanding our worldviews? And also, I would like to say that it includes the descendants of enslaved communities who were forced here and had to make do with in horrendous circumstances with the effects of settler colonialism and the slave trade, and who have a relationship as well to the land that we do today. So accessibility is much more than money. And I would hope that after today, I have influenced you all to begin to think about how do you begin to make accessibility in all kinds of different ways more open to Indigenous and the descendants of enslaved people. All right, so these two pictures are the essence of who I am. To the right, you have my ancestral homelands in Nevada on the California border of June Lake, where my people would fish, catch jackrabbits, and where I would go consistently as a child and up until my teens and recently to go and with my family and learn how to fish and learn how to do things that we used to. I also knew from an early age how to take care of the land. I always knew that I had a relationship with the land and the water. And to the left is of Lake Michigan a few days ago, where I'm now at, and realizing and sitting here and thinking about what is land, how is land impacted, and seeing the similarities between these two photos of the importance of situating land in terms of water and resources and like animals and all of those things. And so as an Indigenous woman, and it's different for everybody, so I can only speak for myself. I will never speak on the behalf of all nations. I can't even speak firmly for my own nation at times. I can only speak for who I am, and what I've experienced is when I go to these spaces and when I go to this land, and when I'm giving a land acknowledgement, it's much more than just checking a box for an organization or an email signature. It's giving thanks to the land and the prayers, gifts, and resources that she has provided us for generations. I think it's important for everyone here to remember that this land has memory. There has been people here for generations before settlement that prayed and ate and laughed and loved and took care of this land before settlers, before the Pilgrims, before anybody. And it remembers us and it asks us to give pieces of ourselves back. So you feed the river, you feed the lake, you give a piece of yourself, I give my hair, and you ask for continued guidance. And I always am humbled to think about how small I am in this world to be able to experience multiple waterways and to have their blessings. And I also am always thinking about who were the ancestors who lived on these lands, including my own, for generation, like who were they? And I have to remember that, again, that history is long. So I had to remember not only my ancestors, but then how my family and numerous others were forcibly removed or killed from our homelands. The children who were kidnapped and forced into slavery and put into boarding schools, and how that must have felt to be ripped apart from these necessary lifeways. To remember those who came here enslaved from other continents, but also to remember that, like, as much as that land remembers those events, she remembers how to heal us and how to keep us going. And that when we give to her, she'll give back. And I honestly think that we're at a point in our society where the abuse that the land has suffered on our behalf is being shown in multiple different ways, through climate change, through you know, icebergs melting, which is basically the same thing, but and you know, there's no rain, like we were talking before, how the rain in the Southwest there's a drought. Um, the fires that happened this past year in the West, all of those things. And I honestly think it's a result of us not understanding how to best take care of this land and the resources that she has provided. And so when I go and I give a piece of myself, or when I go and I sit there and pray and think about all of these things, I also give thanks to her for giving to us despite it all. Um, and again, this is the types of thanks that we should be giving this Thanksgiving, not the idea of I don't believe in the holiday, obviously. And I think that we are, as a society, moving away from it. But there's still this perception that it's the pilgrims and Indians who came together peacefully and broke bread together. But for me, how I celebrate is I give thanks to the land that she's still here providing for us, and that there's lessons that are still here for us, left from our ancestors. And if you want to move into your holiday tonight or today or tomorrow, think about that. Think about that thanks that you should be giving to not only the land, but to the people who have stewarded this for centuries. And that's just my approach to this, as one person from one nation who can't speak for her nation as a whole. So I'm gonna go to the next one. So one thing that I always am encountered, so like that's how I do things. And obviously it's not for everybody. And in my line of work, as you will often find on my blog or ever, my worldview and my sense of understanding is not what is there for everyone. It's very, and I don't believe in decolonization as a term. I believe that we as a society live in a colonized society, unfortunately. Colonization happened. Colonization is resulted in the world in which we are living in right now. So instead of thinking of decolonizing these spaces, I am thinking about how do we begin to move towards action-oriented practices that will get people to create solutions in which Indigenous priorities will be prioritized, will actually have things to react to, where the spaces, like I was alluding to earlier, will be open. So let's create some action-oriented steps to actually create the change that we want to see. I think decolonization has been a great term of having us all as scholars or as people really consider, like, okay, what can a decolonized world look like? However, there hasn't been enough discussion of how do we get there? What are we going to do? And a part of that is related to this slide, in the sense of there's so many things that go into even thinking about what it is to be an action-oriented organization or individual that need to occur before you even do that work. Because I feel like at Land Acknowledgement, which has been done for centuries as people, as Indigenous people, we've always given acknowledgement to the people who call their land, their homelands home, out of respect, and out of love, and it's like when you go to someone's house, there's always a fuss, like, what should I bring? Who should I bring? Like, can I do this? Can I do that? That's the same humility that we bring to these acknowledgements, as well as understanding that all of those lines of history that I alluded to earlier happened on that land and affected those people. So it's in much of the same way as you thinking about what kind of wine should I be bringing to dinner tomorrow? Not that you should. I hope you're all practicing safety and social distancing, but that's the kind of idea that goes behind this, for as far as I know, as an Indigenous person. But in terms of organizations and the settler descendants, basically, there's this need to be like, well, I have a land acknowledgement in my email, or I have a land acknowledgement in my organization or at my school, and therefore I am moving towards decolonization. No, and I don't mean to make this come off as aggressive or as rude or anything like that. I say this with good intentions, that is doing the very bare minimum of the work that you should be doing as an institution, as a person, in acknowledging the history of Indigenous people. and this land. That is the bare minimum. Um, and I say that because it's just checking a box. And now we are at a point in a society where we are seeing the effects of what happens when you just check a box repeatedly and never actually change anything. And that's why we're having all of these, these DEI initiatives happen much more. But what does that mean? So you want to do a land acknowledgement, you want to move towards the quote unquote decolonization, but have you ever, I think institutions never do this enough. And I have that experience from the Field Museum, and they know that I say these things. Like, we never had a discussion on, okay, we want to honor these people, but who are they? What did this land, what did this water, what did this landscape look like before the arrival of settlers? How was it used? How was it tended to? How was it integrated into the ancestral traditions and practices that the people made their lives from? So I study baskets. How were baskets made back then, and what kind of knowledge from the ancestors was given? And it's not to say that you have to completely agree with these worldviews, but there should be a sense of respect in trying to understand where that comes from. Because again, a lot of times I hear like, oh, well, we can't, why do I have to learn all of this? Well, we had to learn very early on of the American lies and narratives of what this nation is. So therefore, I think it's time for us to take a step into thinking about, what does this next phase of this world look like? And it means having to backtrack and do the work yourself and understanding these sources and these understandings. And that means, and if you have ever thought of these things, and if you are there, either individually, organizational wise, what kind of sources have you been relying on? Are they indigenous sources? Are they anthropologists? Are they indigenous anthropologists? Are they from settlers? Like, those things matter. And that's not to say that there isn't a value in looking in settler anthropology documents and all of those things, because in those notes you will find stories, and I honestly think a lot of the time our ancestors left us clues, so that way we could know what to look out for in another way or in another thing. And so those sources are useful. However, they should not be the thing that is leading you towards creating a understanding of these like really convoluted situations and ideals. And especially when I'm thinking about right now in terms of Thanksgiving, I spent a summer at the Peabody Essex Museum. So I actually went to Plymouth Plantation that summer into like 2016. So I'm familiar with the area. And, one thing I was struck by is like this idea that and Boston is amazing, and I'm not saying it's not, but this pride that it has in its understanding of the American Revolution, and how, all of these wonderful people, these white men came and did all these great things, and we all know the history and this pride. However, like, there is no understanding or credence given to the fact that like there are thousands and thousands of people who lived in that area before contact. And the arrogance that existed on the behalf of these pilgrims who came in because they were feeling persecuted, to just come in and have no sympathy for who we are as a people. We weren't people. And I think about this a lot, that, as human beings, if we see someone suffering, we're going to want to help them, hopefully. But we are in that time when the settlers arrived and they brought their diseases and all, they didn't want to go out of their way to help us, or the Wampanoag, at least. And that's hurt. Like, have we ever really stopped to think about that? That where was that humanity, where children are being killed, where people are being enslaved? That humanity isn't there. And that's what and that's not to say it isn't there in certain points, but it's not there enough for us to feel as if they cared about our stories enough to allow us to have space to continue to do this work. So again, the land remembers that though, and the land remembers those prayers, and the land remembers the people who took care of it long before. So that's the first set of questions you should be asking yourself, is how has that land been affected by the presence of settlers? Then it should also include this idea of how did the arrival of settlers impact those relationships to the land and with the people over time? So how did these diseases ravage our communities? How were certain communities put into slavery? How has land been violated to make settler life easier or more accommodating? And I often say this is in reference to the Field Museum, which, and the city of Chicago as a whole, where they reversed the flow of the lake, and they dug into the ground and to make space for collection items from across the world, and human remains. And we never stopped to think about like the harm that was done for that, right? Like, not only are we doing things that aren't natural, but we're doing things in a way to make space for what we are deeming as important, and not what the land thinks is important for us. um, and again, how has this world been impacted? So where, if you live somewhere, I feel like it's a responsibility you have, like, to understand that your house is situated on land where people might have been enslaved or taken from, or you have benefited, honestly all of us have, in some way, shape, or form, from the forced removal or lack of visibility of Native people. Our houses wouldn't be here if it wasn't for that removal. We really need to sit and think about these things. And that's before you do a land acknowledgement panel on anything, on your organization's door, in your email. Because if you don't understand how all of this works, then your land acknowledgement is just an acknowledgement. It means nothing. But if you're doing this work and you're being introspective and you're trying to humble yourself to realize that you don't know what you don't know, then we're not going to ever be able to move forward in a society that creates the changes that we are all saying we want to see after this year in 2020. So I ask you to sit and really think about these things. But also, more importantly, how's the world around you? So monuments, museums, architecture, art has influenced the way you understood us, meaning Indigenous people, and our relationships. And how has Thanksgiving affected your perception of us? When living in Chicago, there's only stereotypical representations of Indigenous people. There's not enough representation of the people who lived here. Again, I refer back to my time in Boston. I didn't see enough of that either. You're given a narrative and you're given a sense of what is deemed important or not based off of what a city government has decided to dedicate a monument to, or a museum to, or the architecture, to make it feel like, and I look at Foucault a lot when it comes to architecture, on, a lot of these places were built to keep a certain group of people out because of the way that they promote dominance, or quote unquote equal, like class. So I think if we don't sit to really think about that, and how our own understanding of the world comes from these things, then again, your land acknowledgement isn't going to amount to much, in my opinion. This is the real work. This is the work that settlers and the descendants of settlers need to do. Again, creating the acknowledgement, sure. Again, do your homework. In the last slide, you should actively look for the Indigenous organizations in your area who are doing this type of work, and contract them to guide your process. There's no more room for us to not be paid, to not have, like, if you're gonna ask us to do this work, the free labor idea is beyond outdated, but is also offensive. We're not here. We do want our people represented well. However, if you don't even give us any sort of compensation in any sort of way, then you're only continuing that colonial narrative that our time and our minds are only as valuable as our presence. Like, you don't actually see us as being the resources that you could utilize in multiple different ways. Realize it's not an easy process, but it's not meant to be. I can't say this enough, everyone, and I have my experience from the Field Museum to say this. It's okay to be wrong, and it's okay to not understand why some of you maybe be like, oh, this girl's like, this woman, this doctor, whatever, is is just spewing all this stuff and it's not based in reality. But I come from a background where my people were removed. My family has intergenerational trauma that I am attempting to change for the next 7 generations, hopefully. And this is what this is to me, is that if you want that for your children or anyone who it's meant to be hard work, because the easy way, the way of understanding our world, has not gotten us very far. So we need to be humble enough to sit back and do the work, including myself. I'm not taking myself out of that at all because I don't know much. So you can consult someone like me to consult with, a shameless plug, where, yeah, I talk to museums, I talk to organizations on how they can do this work. And it usually starts with like the last slide idea. And you need to make sure you know your commitments to those who you contract or consult. So, and that leads me to this last slide, where it shouldn't be you consulted, you contracted me, or you contracted someone in the area and then that's it. No, a land acknowledgement, after you've done your homework, after you've been introspective, after you've done these discussions as a whole organization or with your family members or anything, means that you are pledging yourself or that institution to righting the wrongs of settler colonialism. Because now you know more than you did before. And now you owe it to your children, to your family members, to your friends, to implement the changes that you are talking about that you want to see. So I say that with an understanding that it's not easy. However, this whole year hasn't been easy. If we can get through this, and if we can figure out how to not allow for Trump to be reelected, and if we can figure out how to go out and vote in droves, then we can figure out as a society how to make action-oriented pledges and decisions that will ensure that Indigenous worldviews, ideas, and teachings and truths will be implemented and incorporated, and that you as a person are making space for Indigenous people, including their hiring in multiple ways. And it's time to learn and be introspective. So this Thanksgiving, I am tasking all of you, not my Indigenous brothers and sisters, not you all. Please take the day off. It's Indigenous Peoples Month and we get asked for a lot, which is problematic in itself, but that's a discussion for another day. You are all tasked tomorrow, those who are not Indigenous, with educating your family, your friends and colleagues about how they can learn about Indigenous histories and realities. Now that I've given you all of this to consider, and when I think about it, how this relates back to the School of Design as well, that you need to think about how can those designs implement these worldviews of Indigenous people? How can you incorporate more people, more Indigenous architecture students, and all of these people to bring that sense of place back into the actual physical world, right? There's a lot of different ways that we can be doing this. And it should be your task to sit and think about that, as well as thinking about that the land that you are on has so many different influences and so many different ideas that you could all be utilizing instead of trying to figure out the next best thing. There's already so much provided to us. And I hope that you can take this talk and you can give, I hope you've learned, I've been helpful. I was nervous about doing this because it's humbling for me. And I'm getting emotional and I'm not too sure why. But I think it's because I'm at the point in my career and my life where I just want our histories and our realities and my brothers and sisters to be respected and to feel that they are being cared for in multiple ways. And that's why I do the work that I do. It's to make space for us. And I don't mind being put through the ringer or saying the things that aren't or maybe hard to say, but tomorrow represents a time for a lot of us where the beginning of our of our decimation began, and the humility of not even being considered a human was there, and it's hurtful. So how do we move forward? We begin to have these discussions as a group and as a family, and think about that we should be maybe giving thanks to this land that still sustains us and to that knowledge, rather than some crazy holiday that was just because during the Civil War people were all upset and couldn't get their act together and they needed a reason to come together. So use this time wisely. Thank you. Oh, and I'm sorry. Yeah, I am getting a little teary-eyed, and that never happens to me during a presentation. So,
Miranda, thank you so much for such an amazing presentation. I'd like to open up this portion of your presentation for anyone to feel free to pose any questions. You can enter them into the chat, or you can raise your hand and we will try to field the questions that way. One thing I'd like to ask though is, I know that your work at the Field Museum is also related to working with communities within the region and highlighting narratives that are accurate and more respectful to those communities. Can you talk a little bit about how that work plays into you know, your perspective on how we need to you know, engage with land acknowledgments and gain a better understanding of community and how that plays into accurate portrayals and narrative?
that's an interesting. I think so Chicago is interesting, and I'm not directly involved with that section of the hall because there's a whole other committee. There's always going to be a section of this new hall that is dedicated to Chicago and the people here and the urban Indians. But from what I've experienced is and they know this, and I've said this, if we were given the opportunity to start over our project, we would be on a 10-year timeline of getting to know our collaborators in a more thorough way, meaning that we actually went and go and listen to them and talk to them and hear about them. Because on one hand, we have done that. We do that with communities today. But on the other hand, I don't think it's enough. I think that there needs to be a better understanding of these groups and their needs, rather than just rushing us to make an exhibition or to get something done on the behalf of the museum because of the money that is available at this time. Museums particularly, and the field, again, everything I'm saying the Field Museum knows, so it's not like I don't tell them this too, is based on this reality of us vanishing and no longer being present. And now that we are the idea, and I mean, we've always been, but like, since we are this negotiation between, you know, the museum being a place of education versus the wants of how a community might want to be presented in that education does not always line up. And again, I think it's because a lot of us as a whole, including myself, don't know enough about these communities to do justice by what they may need or what they may not need. I could only go, I see a lot of part of my job is trying to field that. I do a lot of making sure that we're trying to always understand the community members' perspectives as much as possible ahead of what the museum might think is needed or not.
So we have a couple questions in the chat. We have one from Julia Norton, who's asking, I was wondering if you could speak to museum education and how educators and docents can move beyond land acknowledgments and be action-oriented, especially in regards to young people.
Whew. Well, again, going back to my field museum experience, we have a docent program. It's changing now, but we have a Pawnee Earth Lodge, which we are trying to revamp and recontextualize, where we're doing this work with the Pawnee, so they are there, the Pawnee Nation. But the original purpose of this particular lodge is very much based in a antiquated way of thinking. And so the docent program had a script that they had been using since 1970 when the lodge was built and had never changed up until 2019. And when you, and I understand, and it often is interesting to me because for that people who have done that work that long, they have this attachment to the lodge. But I think what ends up happening for me and how I understand it is, we want to give kids this idea of what life was like for us back then. However, we are not willing to actually give them the facts about what that life was like. And so what I mean is, and I told this in an interview, is it's okay to share the honest histories of what happened with us to young people, because we had to learn it. Like people like me as a person, I had to learn things really the hard way. And I think that if we don't begin to move forward, and if we don't begin to be honest, and if we don't begin to make space for those children to actually have a space where they can express those frustrations, then we aren't doing a service to them. We are actually just continuously harming them. And so I think docents and volunteers need to also create their own maybe coalition of some sort where this introspective work is being done on your behalf, for yourselves, and figuring out what do the youth need from in your direct community, and how do we begin to bring in more Black and Brown youth into this fold. And the needs of those youths are going to be different than the needs of the suburban kids. And how do we begin to try to bring them together, but then also address each of their needs? And it's going to look different. And I know I can already hear complaints from parents, but that's, I think, the most important thing is having to dedicate yourself and your time as a group to being and doing this introspective work.
I have another question by Violet Luxton. What about land acknowledgments where local First Nations are not in consensus on who was the first and have contested names for members of the same nation? How to honor when the community itself is divided? Have you worked in a similar situation?
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's here in Chicago. There's all kinds of different, who was here first, who wasn't. And I think, in my opinion, and I don't know First Nation relations that well. I see my colleague who is First Nation, is here, who has a question about the land back movement in the First Nations, who would be able to answer this question a lot better than I will. So she can pass along any information to you. But I think that for me, I think, and I've talked to this about with a friend recently too, is that our stories are very much grounded, our ancestral stories are very much grounded in place and in land. And so our understanding of that landscape is derived from some of those stories. And we are able to say, like, this lake and the lake that looked like we use the environment to be able to say where things were done and how things were done, and our stories pinpoint to specific ideas. And honestly, when nation, and I can't speak for every nation because again, I don't know. I think what ends up happening is when we fight like that, when we are trying to claim a piece of land that isn't meant to be claimed in that way, we are continuing the harm of settler colonialism. Because who am I to say that this land didn't belong to a group of people? Who am I to say that, maybe I don't understand it that well. Maybe I don't get it that well, but like as a person, as a Paiute woman, I would never ever tell like an Ojibwe or a Potawatomi person like, well, you know, I heard this from this person, so therefore this isn't your land. Like that's not my place. What I can only say is those nations need to understand that this concept is a lot larger than us. And if you continuously harm and try to do that, I honestly think that the land will create a situation where like you're just going to keep infighting with each other because it's we're not supposed to own any part of the land, in my opinion, in the way that we understand it from a colonial perspective. Um, we should have that respect that we wouldn't be saying this is our land if we didn't know it. I wouldn't be making that statement just because if I didn't know it. But I can't speak for everybody, so I hope that helps.
Julia Barksdale has a question, and she says, as an aspiring designer from both settler and indigenous descent, I'm constantly torn with the tasks of designing built forms on land that was once owed to my ancestors, by my ancestors. I would love to use my final semester of architecture education to explore that intersection of designing for inherently colonizer society, while also paying respect to the people who tended this land. Thank you for a great presentation. There was a question related to land back. Do you want to share any thoughts about how #landback movement might play out in urban spaces? In Caledonia, Ontario, and in Wet'suwet'en Traditional Territory in British Columbia, this movement began this year as a demand to respect unceded lands and treaty rights and to stop ongoing colonial expansion. How can you envision land back transitioning into a future movement to make or reclaim space?
Ooh. Well, twofold. Again, I think, yes, if you have any extra land that you're not using, go ahead, give it back to the nations who called that land. I had one woman who actually was like, oh, I lived in like 10, she had like 10 acres and she didn't use all of it. And I was like, you could give some of that back. But beyond that, you know, I think what it is again, we live in this society where we are forced to have to deal with the results of a colonial narrative. But if we can't get all of the land back as much as I would like to, and there are efforts, like there's the Oneida here in Wisconsin who are doing this, there are nations actively buying back land and using their treaty rights. And like what happened with the Muskogee in Oklahoma this past year on having their treaty rights respected through the Supreme Court is a big, huge deal. And the way that continues to happen is through these efforts led by these communities to continuously fight the systems that were meant to not be accommodating to who they are. And that's a lot of fight. That's a lot of fight. That's a lot of personal fighting for your people, for your group. I envision land back hopefully as being, honestly, because unless, and again, I go back to decolonization with this too, is to decolonize would mean that nothing happened, that no colonization happened, like in the way that I understand it. But it did. So how do we begin to tend to the earth in the way that it was tended for generations beforehand? Like, how can we make a better garden? How can we make things more that are visually appealing to Indigenous people that aren't so stark and abstract and harsh? How do we make them more? How do we begin to incorporate our knowledge into stewarding the land today? And I honestly think that if we're able to give that kind of perspective, so if we can begin to tend the land that we live on individually or as an institution, then we can begin to help the land heal, and eventually maybe someday we will be able to have that land back in its full form. Again, though, I think it's a complex concept. I mean, anyone who knows this, like, just give me land back, and it's often used. We use it as a like a bit of humor in our in Indigenous circles. But for me, land back is also much more of getting the land back to a sense of how it was before colonization. It's also a practice in tending it and stewarding it and teaching others on how to do that. So eventually the earth, and we can help the earth heal from the effects of colonization. Yeah, I hope that helps. I hope that answers. As I'm sure you could speak better to this too. In another, maybe me and you will do a presentation too.
So I'm just checking the chat to see if we have any additional questions.
Well, I see one. What kind of conversations do you wish people would be having about how to preserve and acknowledge land? Ooh, that's a good one. You know, yeah, a majority of my time, and I don't mind this. This is what I do. I am dedicated to helping any space figure out how to work better with us, and all Indigenous people. And so my role, as I understand it, is to go into an institution and not tell them like this is this community's history and this is how it should. I can't do that. That's not my place. But what I can do is pinpoint, this is where you're running into problems and why Indigenous people don't want to work with you. This is why you're problematic. And this is what you should be doing to get to the point that you eventually want to get at. And a lot of the time that means having to get to the situation where we're at today, like I was saying, where you were having leadership involved in these types of talks, right? They're listening to these types of presentations where you're giving them resources. Like in institutional culture does not lend itself at all to talking. It very much just lends itself to productivity, as we all know. So I think that the first notion of this needs to happen with being and forming circles around where, you know, you're having these types of discussions, and then figuring out what is wrong directly with your institution and how it should be fixed, and including that and understanding that includes acknowledging land and all of that type of stuff. It's not easy work, and I do this work because it's needed. And I don't mean this again to be rude, white people just don't know. People just don't know. And they weren't taught that way to know. And it sucks. And it's draining. But if we don't do it, if we don't try to give them the tools and these places the tools that they need, then that type of work can't ever be fulfilled. And that's not to say I do this and I give them everything of myself, but I give enough to the point where if they don't follow through on my recommendations or on my idea or whatever type of thing, then they can only be held accountable for themselves, and they'll be shown for their true colors in time. And I think that's the threat to a lot of institutions today, is that that's what's scaring them. I mean, and it's true. So I hope that makes sense.
So Meranda, thank you so much for joining us today. For those that would like to pose more questions, we welcome you to feel free to get in touch with Meranda or the Harvard Indigenous Design Collective. Before everyone leaves, I'd just like to quickly announce that we will be hosting one more event, which is coming up on December 16th, entitled Mixing Mud, Playing Around Vernacular Pueblo Architectures of the Southwest, featuring Garrett Yeppa of Jemez Pueblo and the Navajo Nation, as well as Dr. Porter Swensel of Santa Clara Pueblo. Mixing Mud is a presentation on the ontology of Indigenous design and architecture of the Pueblo tribes of the Southwest. I've posted the RSVP link in the chat. We also have posted the mailing list in the chat, which is open to everyone. You don't need to be affiliated with Harvard or be a student. It'll just allow you to be informed for future and ongoing conversations that the Harvard Indigenous Design Collective will be hosting. So thank you so much for attending today. Have a wonderful Thanksgiving, And if you have additional questions, feel free to stick around.
Thank you all. Thank you.